The crystal ship descended through Earth's atmosphere like a shard of starlight, its prismatic surface catching the morning sun and casting rainbow patterns across the sky. Citizens of New York stopped in their tracks, their eyes drawn to the alien vessel that moved with deliberate grace between the skyscrapers. Each facet of the ship's hull told a story of victory. 300 crystalline plates, each one added after its master defeated another world's champion. High Master Kithrix of the Varathani had chosen Earth as his next conquest, not through military might or economic pressure, but through what his species considered the purest form of dominance: ritual combat. The Varathani believed that a civilization's worth could be measured by its martial arts, and Kithrix had spent the last 30 Earth years proving his species' superiority across the galaxy. The ship settled in Central Park, its landing struts extending like delicate crystal spiders. The gathered crowd watched as the hull shifted and flowed, opening like a blooming flower. Kithrix emerged, his four arms moving in perfect harmony as he descended the crystalline stairway. His iridescent scales caught the light much like his ship, and the bioluminescent patterns that rippled across his skin spoke of his status to any who could read the complex language of Varathani body art. "I come before you." His voice resonated through the translation field. "As one who has studied the combat forms of 300 worlds, I have crossed blades with the gas giant swimmers of the Jovian clouds, matched skills with the living metal warriors of the Forge worlds, and bested the quantum phase duelists of the spiral arm." He paused, his upper arms spreading wide, while his lower ones moved through a series of precise gestures. "And now I come to Earth, this barely spacefaring world that still clings to physical weapons and primitive combat forms." The crowd's murmur grew as holographic displays materialized around him, showing his previous duels. Each victory was more spectacular than the last, his energy blades dancing through impossible patterns, his four-armed combat style creating defenses that no two-armed species could hope to penetrate. "Your species has barely touched the stars," Kithrix continued, his voice carrying a note of carefully calculated condescension. "You still train with steel and wood, teaching forms that were old when your people thought the earth was flat. I have reviewed your combat archives, boxing, wrestling, your so-called martial arts. They are children's games compared to the bio-enhanced combat forms of truly advanced species." The Global Defense Council representatives stood at the edge of the gathering, their faces masking the concern they felt. They knew what was coming. The same challenge that had been issued to 300 other worlds. Either accept a ritual duel or admit to the galaxy that Earth's martial traditions were indeed primitive and unworthy. Kithrix raised his upper right arm, an energy blade shimming into existence. The weapon's light shifted through colors that human eyes had never seen before, each hue representing a different victory. "I challenge your world to send forward its greatest warrior. Let them face me in the ancient rites of combat, and I will demonstrate why your species still plays with primitive weapons while the rest of the galaxy has evolved beyond such things." The challenge hung in the air like a thundercloud. The alien champion's bioluminescence pulsed with patterns that even the translation field struggled to convey: confidence, superiority, and an almost pitying amusement at having to prove his point to such an underdeveloped world. As news networks broadcast the challenge globally, the Varathani champion added one final bar: "You have one standard week to choose your champion. Choose wisely. Though it will make little difference, your defeat will be added to my ship's hull." A testament to the gap between human martial arts and true combat mastery. The Global Defense Council chamber buzzed with tension as holographic displays showed potential champions from around the world. Special Forces operators demonstrated their skills, Olympic athletes displayed their prowess, and modern martial arts champions exhibited their techniques. Each candidate possessed remarkable skills, yet something was missing. A quality that none could quite define. "With all due respect," General Sarah Martinez said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "we're looking at this all wrong. We're trying to match the alien's flashiness, his technology. That's a battle we've already lost." She stood, drawing all eyes in the room. "I have someone else in mind." The holographic display shifted to show a remote mountain valley in Montana. There, nestled between ancient pines and snow-capped peaks, stood a sprawling complex that blended traditional Japanese architecture with modern design. The Rising Sun Dojo, founded 20 years ago by Catherine Kate Sullivan, had become a legend in certain circles. The camera zoomed in on a training session. A woman in her late 50s moved through a complex sword form, her silver hair tied back in a practical braid, her movements displaying an economy of motion that made the younger practitioners around her look almost clumsy by comparison. Each strike, each step, each breath seemed to flow like water, simple, yet carrying the weight of decades of experience. Catherine Sullivan, Martins continued, former Special Forces, master of 7 different sword traditions, and perhaps the most qualified person on Earth to face this challenge. The general tapped her console, bringing up Kate's service record. But it's not her military background that makes her special. It's what she did after. The display showed glimpses of Kate's journey, training with sword masters across the globe, studying everything from medieval European longsword to Japanese katana, Korean sword arts to Chinese jian. But more than that, it showed her teaching. Former Special Forces operators trained alongside troubled teens. Native American warriors practiced with European historical martial artists. Her dojo had become a crucible where different traditions merged and evolved. "Ma'am," a junior officer interjected, "she's using a wooden sword against opponents with energy blades. How can?" The general raised her hand, and the display shifted to show Kate in a recent exhibition match. Her opponent, a champion mixed martial artist half her age, charged with speed and power. Kate simply wasn't there when his strike landed, and her counter, a simple tap with a wooden sword, left the champion wondering how he'd ended up on the ground. "The Varthani think our martial arts are primitive because they're old," Martins explained. "They're missing the point. These arts have survived and evolved for thousands of years because they work." Catherine Sullivan doesn't just practice these arts. She understands them at a level few others do. The council watched as the display showed Kate working with her students. She moved among them, making tiny adjustments to their forms, explaining how a single movement could contain counters to dozens of different attacks. Her teaching style was patient but intense, each lesson building on centuries of accumulated knowledge. "The Varthani champion has 4 arms and energy blades," Martins concluded, "but Catherine Sullivan has something more valuable: the distilled combat experience of countless warriors who came before her. Every movement she makes has been tested in combat, refined over generations, and proven effective against any opponent." The chamber fell silent as the final clip played. Kate stood in her dojo's garden, moving through a simple sword form as snow fell around her. Each movement was perfect, not because it was flashy or complex, but because there was nothing unnecessary in it, nothing wasted, nothing left to chance. "I've already spoken with her," Martins said softly. "She's willing to accept the challenge, but she has one condition. She wants to face Kithrix using traditional weapons. No energy blades, no bioenhancements, just steel and skill." The council members exchanged glances. It seemed almost absurd, sending a woman armed with a simple sword against an alien champion with technologies they barely understood. But there was something in Kate's movements, in the quiet confidence she displayed, that made them wonder if perhaps they'd found exactly who they needed. The Montana dawn painted the snow-capped mountains gold as Catherine Sullivan began her daily routine. While the world's media buzzed with speculation about the upcoming duel, she knelt in her dojo's garden, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. A simple wooden sword lay across her knees, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Across the valley, cameras captured High Master Cthrix's latest display of martial prowess. His forearms wielded energy blades in dazzling patterns, creating a web of light that drew gasps from the gathered crowd. Observe, his voice carried through the translation field. How your primitive two-armed form limits your combat potential. He demonstrated a complex series of strikes that seemed to attack from every angle simultaneously. Back at the Rising Sun Dojo, Kate stood and began her morning practice. Her students watched in respectful silence as she moved through forms from different traditions. A medieval German longsword pattern flowed into a Japanese kata, then transitioned into a Chinese straight sword technique. Each movement was deliberate, refined, and somehow both ancient and timeless. Master Sullivan called out Marcus Red Eagle, one of her senior students and a former Army Ranger. The news says Cthrix has never lost a duel. They're showing footage of his previous fights. Maybe we should. Kate's quiet voice carried across the training floor. Bring up the footage. As her students gathered around the holographic display, she continued her practice, but her eyes tracked every movement of the alien champion's previous duels. Meanwhile, Cthrix had moved on to demonstrating his species' natural advantages. His bioelectric sensing organs could detect an opponent's muscle movements before they struck. His four-armed combat style could attack and defend simultaneously. Your champion, he announced to the cameras, will face techniques perfected over 10,000 years by warriors with superior biology and technology. In the dojo, Kate paused her practice. Watch his left lower arm, she instructed her students. Every time he generates that light pattern, he shifts his weight to his back leg. It's beautiful, but it's unnecessary movement. She demonstrated a simple cut, one that any beginning student would learn. This would strike between his actions when he's committed to the pattern. Throughout the day, masters from different sword traditions arrived at the dojo. A Korean sword master demonstrated how their techniques had evolved to counter multiple opponents. A European historical martial arts expert shared insights from medieval fighting manuals. Each visitor added their knowledge to Kate's preparation, but more importantly, each one reminded her of the unbroken line of warriors who had refined these arts through combat and practice. As evening approached, Cthrix concluded his display with a flourish that left afterimages dancing in the air. I have studied your world's combat forms, he declared. They are museum pieces, preserved out of sentiment rather than practical value. The sun was setting when Kate's students found her still practicing, repeating a single cut over and over. Not the complex patterns they'd seen earlier, just one simple, direct strike. Marcus watched her movement, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's the same cut you showed us this morning, he said. The basic one. Kate nodded, continuing the practice. Every strike I've shown you today has been the same strike, just viewed from different angles, different traditions. She performed the cut again, and her students could see how it contained elements from every style they'd studied. Our ancestors faced every kind of opponent, every kind of weapon. They distilled their experience into these forms, these basic movements. She paused, looking at the distant lights where Cthrix continued his demonstrations. He thinks our arts are primitive because they're old. He doesn't understand that they're old because they work, because they contain the essential truths of combat that no amount of technology can change. As night fell over the mountains, two very different preparations continued. Cthrix refined his light shows and energy patterns, while Kate practiced that same simple cut over and over, each repetition carrying the weight of thousands of years of human combat experience. Her students watched, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something more than practice. They were seeing the distillation of human martial arts into its purest form. The exhibition hall had been constructed overnight by Varthani engineers, its crystal walls rising from the Montana soil like a garden of frozen light. Representatives from 50 alien species filled the observation platforms, their varied forms creating a living tapestry of galactic diversity. The pre-duel exhibition was more than tradition. It was a mandatory display of each combatant's art form, their philosophy made manifest through movement. Kithrix entered first, his scale armor catching and amplifying the hall's ambient light. The arena's crystal floor began to pulse with bioluminescent patterns that matched his movements as he took his position at the center. His forearms raised in a traditional Varthani salute that set ripples of light dancing through the air. Behold, his voice resonated through the translation field, the 17th form of the Star Dancer's path. His energy blades hummed to life, each one tuned to a different frequency that created harmonics in the crystal chamber. What followed was a display of technical mastery that seemed to defy physics itself. Kithrix's lower arms created a defensive sphere of light, while his upper arms wove attack patterns so complex they left trace images in the air. Each movement triggered responses in the crystal floor, creating a symphony of light and energy that drew gasps from even the most reserved alien diplomats. His bioelectric field interacted with the chamber's acoustics, adding an otherworldly chorus to his performance. When he finished, the chamber rang with appreciative clicks, hums, and other alien expressions of approval. Thrix bowed, his scale patterns shifting to display his satisfaction. "That," he announced, "is but a taste of true combat evolution. Now let us see what passes for mastery on this world." Catherine Sullivan entered without ceremony, wearing a traditional black hakama and white jai. The simple wooden sword at her side seemed almost absurd in the high-tech chamber. She bowed once to the assembled dignitaries, then once to her opponent. The contrast between her plain appearance and Kithrix's ethereal display could not have been more stark. "I will demonstrate," she said simply, the first form taught to beginning students. Several alien observers shifted restlessly, expecting something insultingly basic. Kithrix's bioluminescence pulsed, with what the translation field interpreted as amusement. Kate began with the most basic of sword drawings. But as the wooden blade cleared its scabbard, something changed in the chamber's atmosphere. Her movement was simple, yet it contained a quality that drew every eye. The blade described a perfect arc through the air, its path so pure that several alien martial scientists found themselves leaning forward, sensing something their instruments couldn't quite measure. She moved through the basic strikes: up, down, diagonal, thrust. Each cut was the same as the one she'd been practicing for days, yet each showed it from a different angle. There was no wasted energy, no flourish, nothing added for display. The wooden sword moved as if it were drawing lines in the fabric of reality itself. An elder Varthani scholar, watching from the highest tier, suddenly activated his deep scanning sensors. His multiple eyes widened as the data flowed in. Each of Kate's movements, though seemingly simple, created perfect geometric patterns in the air. The angles of her cuts bisected the space around her with mathematical precision that spoke of countless hours of refinement. Thrix's amusement faded as he watched. His bioelectric sense told him something his eyes refused to accept. Every one of those basic movements could counter his most advanced techniques. The simple forms contained hidden depths, like still water that concealed an ocean's worth of knowledge. Kate concluded with the same simple cut she'd started with, but now the observers could see it differently. What had seemed basic was revealed as essential, like a single note that contained all of music within it. She bowed again, first to the dignitaries, then to Kithrix. "That," she said quietly, "is what every student learns on their first day. It contains everything they will ever need to know." She turned to leave, but paused. "One more thing. Every movement you just saw has been tested in combat for over 3,000 years. These are not museum pieces, High Master. They are living knowledge, paid for in blood and sweat by countless warriors before me. The crystal chamber fell silent as the two champions left the arena. Tomorrow would bring the actual duel, but something had already changed. The alien observers found themselves reconsidering their definition of advanced combat arts, while Kithrix faced an unsettling question. What if true mastery lay not in adding complexity, but in perfecting the essential? The mountain night wrapped around the rising sun dojo like a velvet cloak, stars gleaming like scattered diamonds above the snow-capped peaks. Inside, Catherine Sullivan sat in the traditional meeting room, steam rising from a cup of green tea as she reviewed ancient scrolls spread across the low table before her. The scrolls, some dating back centuries, showed diagrams of sword techniques that had been passed down through generations. The soft chime of the dojo's entry system broke the night's silence. On the security display, an unexpected visitor waited. Scholar Master Vexthal of the Varathani, his multiple eyes reflecting the moonlight, his scale patterns shifting in what the translation field interpreted as academic agitation. "Please enter," Kate called out, her voice carrying through the night air. The elderly Varathani made his way through the garden path, his movement suggesting both great age and careful dignity. His bioluminescent patterns, unlike Hithrix's aggressive displays, pulsed with subtle questions and theories. "Master Sullivan," he began as he settled onto the cushion she offered, his forearms arranging themselves in a scholarly pose. "I have spent the last 6 hours analyzing the data from your exhibition. There is something." He paused, his scales shifting through patterns that the translation field struggled to convey. "Something that defies our understanding." Kate poured a second cup of tea, the simple ceremony drawing the scholar's attention. "Your movements today," he continued, "they created perfect geometric patterns in space-time. Each cut, each step, they showed optimization that our most advanced combat computers cannot match. Yet you claim these are basic forms." She nodded, lifting her cup in a traditional salute before sipping. "Would you like to see something, Scholar Master?" At his eager nod, she rose and retrieved a worn leather book from a nearby shelf. Opening it carefully, she revealed pages of detailed combat diagrams from medieval Europe. "This is Fior de Liberi's manuscript from 1409, she explained, turning the pages gently. "Look at this simple guard position. It contains counters to every possible angle of attack. The master who created this had fought in real battles, had taught knights who depended on these techniques for survival." Vexthal's scanning organs hummed as he studied the diagrams. "But these are primitive drawings," he said, though his tone held more question than statement. Kate smiled, moving to a practice area. "Let me show you something." She took up a training sword and assumed the guard position from the manuscript. This single stance was developed through countless duels. Every angle, every weight distribution, it's all there for a reason. "Now, attack me." The scholar hesitated, then extended one of his lower arms, moving it in a traditional Varthani strike pattern. Kate's sword moved once, almost too fast to see, and his attack found only empty air. "That counter," she explained, "is shown in the manuscript. It was true in 1409, and it's true now. Physics doesn't change." Understanding began to dawn in the scholar's multiple eyes. "Your combat arts," he said slowly, "they're not just techniques passed down. They're a living laboratory of combat. Each generation testing, refining, proving what works and discarding what doesn't." Kate nodded, returning to the table. "Every time two humans have fought throughout history, they've added to this knowledge. Every war, every duel, every training session. It's all been distilled down to these essential movements. We don't need forearms or energy blades, because we found the fundamental principles that underlie all combat. Vexthal's scales had shifted to a deep blue of revelation. That's why you keep practicing that same cut, isn't it? It's not just a movement. It's the physical expression of everything your species has learned about combat. Now you begin to understand, Kate said softly. Tomorrow, when I face Cathrix, I won't be fighting him alone. I'll be fighting with the knowledge of every warrior who ever lived and died learning these arts. That's what your champion doesn't understand yet. He's not facing one human. He's facing the distilled combat experience of an entire species. As the night deepened around them, scholar and warrior continued their discussion, bridge building between two very different approaches to the art of combat. And somewhere in the darkness, the ancient masters who had passed down these traditions seemed to nod in approval. Dawn painted the crystal arena in shades of rose and gold, the transparent walls offering a panoramic view of the Montana mountains. Snow-capped peaks stood like ancient guardians against the morning sky, as spectators from 100 worlds filled the floating observation platforms. The arena floor, a perfect circle of living crystal, thrummed with barely contained energy. Cathrix entered from the eastern gate, his scale armor now a deep crimson that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His four arms moved in perfect synchronization as he activated his energy blades, each one humming at a different frequency that created an unsettling harmony in the crystal chamber. Catherine Sullivan emerged from the western gate, still wearing her simple black hakama and white jai. The wooden sword at her side drew confused murmurs from the alien spectators. Many had assumed she would choose more advanced weapons for the actual duel. Her students, watching from a designated platform, sat in perfect Caesar position, their faces showing absolute faith in their teacher. The terms are set, the chief arbiter announced through the translation field. Victory by submission, or first killing strike. May the most evolved combat form prevail. The crystal floor beneath the combatants began to pulse with bioluminescent patterns, creating a living record of their movements. Thrix initiated his opening sequence, the Thousand Light Storm, a technique that had never failed him in 300 duels. His four arms created a sphere of intersecting energy blades around him, each one moving in a different pattern that made predicting their paths impossible. The air itself seemed to sing with the power of his movement. Observe, his voice carried across the arena, the futility of facing evolved combat forms with primitive weapons. The sphere of energy began to expand, the blades weaving tighter and tighter patterns that would force any opponent to either retreat or be shredded. Kate took one step forward. The movement was so simple that many observers initially missed its significance. She didn't try to dodge the expanding sphere or counter its energy patterns. Instead, she simply moved into it, her wooden sword describing a single perfect arc through the air. Time seemed to slow as the two styles met. Cathrix's bioelectric sense screamed warnings his combat computer couldn't process. The simple strike contained angles his defense couldn't account for. It was like trying to stop a river with a light show. The wooden sword passed through a gap in the energy pattern that Cathrix hadn't even known existed. It was the same cut Kate had practiced thousands of times, the same basic movement she taught to beginning students. But now everyone could see what it really was, the distilled essence of every sword strike ever thrown in human history. Cathrix's upper right arm moved to block, acting on combat programming that had never failed before. But Kate's blade wasn't where his defense expected it to be. It had already moved through the space his arm was trying to protect. His other arms scrambled to compensate, energy blades creating new defense patterns, but they were all reacting to where the sword had been, not where it was going. The Thousand Light Storm, pride of the Varthani combat forms, shattered into fragments of light as the wooden sword completed its arc. The simple cut had done more than break through Cathrix's defense. It had revealed the fundamental flaw in his entire approach to combat. All his complexity, all his technology, had been defeated by a movement so basic that children learning their first sword form would recognize it. The arena fell silent as Kate's sword stopped a hair's breadth from Kithrix's primary neural cluster. The crystal floor recorded the moment in bioluminescent patterns that would be studied by combat scholars for generations to come. One perfect cut, containing within it the martial knowledge of an entire species. "This," Kate said softly, her voice carrying in the perfect stillness, "is why we still practice the basic forms. They contain everything we need to know about combat, about life, about the nature of conflict itself. Your light show was beautiful, High Master, but you forgot the first rule of any fight. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication." The crystal arena held its breath as Catherine Sullivan lowered her wooden sword from Kithrix's neural cluster. The Varthani champion stood motionless, his bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors that the translation field couldn't interpret. 300 victories, 300 worlds worth of combat experience, all undone by a single perfect cut. But then Kate did something unexpected. She stepped back, returned to her starting position, and bowed. "Would you like to understand why that worked?" she asked, her voice carrying the same tone she used with her most promising students. Kithrix's multiple eyes focused on her, his combat computer still trying to process the impossibility of what had just happened. You could have ended the duel," he said, his scales shifting from battle red to a more contemplative blue. "This was never about winning or losing," Kate replied, raising her sword to a basic guard position. "It's about understanding. Attack me again, but this time, watch what happens to your center of balance when you create your light patterns." The alien champion hesitated, then initiated a simpler version of his energy blade sequence. This time, Kate moved more slowly, letting him see how her single cut exploited a minute shift in his stance. "You see," she demonstrated the principle again, breaking it down. This knowledge was paid for in blood by warriors who lived and died thousands of years ago. They learned that every complex movement has a simple counter. Understanding began to dawn in Kithrix's expression. He modified his attack, trying to correct the flaw she'd shown him. Kate nodded approvingly and showed him another basic movement, this one drawn from medieval European sword masters. "Your forearms give you incredible advantages," she explained, "but they also create 4 times as many opportunities for an opponent to read your intentions." The audience watched in amazement as the duel transformed into something else entirely. The feared Varthani champion began to move more like a student, his energy blades now used to explore rather than to overwhelm. Each exchange became a lesson, a dialogue between 2 very different approaches to combat. "Your technology is remarkable," Kate said, as she demonstrated how a simple pivot could negate his most advanced techniques. "But remember, every movement you make must follow the same physical laws that governed combat when humans first picked up sticks to fight. Those laws haven't changed." Thrix's combat computer began to identify patterns it had never been programmed to recognize. The basic human forms contained layers of meaning. Each movement evolved through countless battles to achieve maximum efficiency. "Our records speak of ancient masters," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Warriors who could defeat energy weapons with simple blades. We thought they were myths." "They weren't myths," Kate replied, demonstrating a technique that had been old when Roman legions marched. "They were teachers. Everything I'm showing you was taught to me by my master, who learned it from their master, in an unbroken line stretching back through history." As they continued their exchange, the alien spectators began to see something their combat computers had missed. The human forms weren't primitive. They were essential, like mathematical equations reduced to their most basic expression. They contained universal truths about the nature of combat itself. Thrix finally lowered his energy blades, his scales now showing patterns of deep respect. "I have won 300 duels," he said, "but today is the first time I have truly learned something about combat. Our technology made us forget the foundations upon which all martial arts must be built." Kate sheathed her wooden sword and bowed. "Every student who walks into my dojo learns the same thing. The most advanced techniques are the basic ones performed with perfect understanding. Your energy blades and forearms don't change that truth. They just give you new ways to express it." The Crystal Arena's recording systems captured every moment, every exchange, creating a record that would be studied by both human and alien warriors for generations to come. It showed more than just a duel. It showed the moment when advanced technology rediscovered the timeless wisdom of traditional combat arts. 1 month after the historic duel, the Rising Sun Dojo had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The morning sun still painted the Montana mountains gold, but now its light reflected off both traditional wood and alien crystal. In the main training hall, Catherine Sullivan watched as her newest students struggled with the most basic of sword forms. Thrix, the former champion of the Varathani, moved through the beginning kata with all 4 arms holding wooden training swords. His bioluminescent patterns showed frustration as he tried to unlearn 3 centuries of combat programming. "You're still thinking like a Varathani warrior," Kate said gently, adjusting his stance. "Try it with just 2 swords for now. Remember what we discussed about economy of movement." The alien champion nodded, his scales shifting to a more focused blue as he set aside 2 of the training weapons. Around them, human students practiced alongside representatives from a dozen different species. A young Centaurian worked on basic strikes, while a crystalline being from the Rigel system studied the subtle weight shifts of European longsword guards. "Master Sullivan," Kithrick said as he completed the form, "I've been analyzing the combat records from our duel. Every time I think I understand the depth of human martial arts, I find another layer." His translator struggled to convey the mix of frustration and wonder in his voice. Kate smiled, leading him to the dojo's garden, where Marcus Red Eagle was teaching a group of alien diplomats about the warrior traditions of his people. "That's because you're still looking for complexity," she explained. "Watch the children." In a smaller training area, a group of human children practiced alongside young aliens, all of them learning the same basic movements. There was no difference in how they were taught. The universal principles of balance, timing, and distance worked the same for every species. "Your people have enhanced speed, multiple limbs, and bioelectric senses," Kate continued. "But watch how that young Varathani moves when she's not trying to use those advantages. See how the movement becomes more natural." Thrix's combat computer registered something his previous programming had never considered. The young ones moved better because they hadn't yet learned to complicate things. "We built our combat forms around our advantages," he said slowly, "instead of building them on fundamental principles first." The dojo had become more than a martial arts school. It was now an interstellar cultural center. In one corner, Scholar Master Vexthal led a research team, studying the mathematical principles behind traditional sword forms. Their findings had already revolutionized several fields of alien combat science. High Master, a young Varathani warrior approach, her scales showing respect patterns. "The Galactic Council has approved our request. The Rising Sun Dojo is now officially recognized as the first human-led institution for advanced combat studies." Kate accepted the news with a simple nod, but her students, both human and alien, broke into celebrations. The recognition meant more than just status. It meant that human martial arts would be preserved and studied throughout the galaxy. "There's something else," the young warrior continued, her patterns shifting to show excitement. 3 more dojos have opened on different worlds, each one teaching the basic forms alongside their own combat traditions. They're calling it the Foundation Movement. Kithrix watched as Kate returned to the training floor, where a new group of students awaited instruction. "Begin with the first form," she said, just as she had thousands of times before. The mixed group of humans and aliens raised their training weapons, each one about to learn the same lesson he had. That true mastery begins with understanding the basics. As the sun climbed higher over the mountains, the dojo continued its work. In one room, quantum physicists studied the perfect geometry of a sword cut. In another, alien warriors learned to put aside their advanced technology and feel the simple truth of the well-executed strike. And in the main hall, Catherine Sullivan taught as she always had, passing down knowledge that had been earned through centuries of human experience. The crystal ship that had once represented Kithrix's victories now stood in the dojo's garden, repurposed as a library where both human and alien students could study the records of their shared martial heritage. Its crystalline surfaces no longer displayed conquest, but rather the promise of understanding between species, one basic movement at a time.